I think a lot of people have come to see these maps as the original sin, almost in a theological sense, of American spatial racism.
I shall never forget that it is more than 100 years ago when Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. But it was a proclamation. It was not a fact.
I'm a planner, writer, researcher, advocate around cities and housing and equity. And I'm currently a senior fellow with the Center for Community Progress in Washington, D.C. The Homeowner Loan Corporation created a bunch of maps back in the 1930s, which categorized American neighborhoods as A, B, C, and D. And they created maps that were colored in different colors for each of these categories, with the D maps being in red. Around that, a whole structure of belief has grown up that these maps essentially defined the future of American urban neighborhoods and are basically the principal, or certainly a significant cause, of the spatial and racial disadvantages that we see even to this day in American cities.
The Homeowners Loan Corporation. Basically, it tried to make home buying much more affordable by subsidizing the cost of building and lending such that people would be able to afford to buy for the first time.
In the 1930s, as part of the New Deal, FDR created loan programs to help Americans finance their homes. But to decide who got those loans, the government created color-coded maps in which green neighborhoods were good and red neighborhoods were bad.
The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from.
So it's everywhere. I mean, there's hardly an organization that works on issues of spatial racism with any kind of liberal or progressive credentials that doesn't use the HOLC maps as the starting point for whatever they're describing. And what my research shows is two things. First thing is that there is no evidence connecting these maps to any concrete act that had anything to do with discriminatory lending, credit disadvantage, etc., or anything else in the neighborhoods that were mapped. And secondly, that there is a clear reason as to why and how American urban neighborhoods organized the way they have over the last 100 years. And the fact that the maps are consistent with that is essentially a coincidence, because there are other reasons that drove the spatial and racial inequalities that we see in American city neighborhoods. There's a statistical association between the maps and certain aspects of American urban neighborhoods, but that does not mean there's any meaningful relationship between the two. The HOLC was an unusual agency with a very specific purpose, and a lot of people believe that somehow the HOLC made loans to home buyers. Basically, they were created to stabilize the mortgage industry and home ownership by buying distressed mortgages from home buyers at the time of a massive foreclosure crisis in the United States. And that's all they did, and they were basically empowered to do that for 3 years. Essentially, what they were doing is borrowing money from the U.S. Treasury and using it to buy the mortgages of homeowners from the banks, and then restructure the mortgages so the homeowners could stay in. Now, the interesting thing, and people have studied this very closely, is for whatever reasons, the HOLC, number one, they made just about as many loans in the red areas as anywhere else. Number two, they made, on average, just about as many loans relative to the total number of homeowners to black homeowners as they did to white homeowners. Now, it's not that they were anti-racists. The correspondence that has been published, the internal office correspondence that has been published, shows that they were just as racist as pretty much the average white male banker of the time. But perhaps they were more concerned with bailing out the banks than the homeowners. Perhaps they felt a duty, perhaps whatever. For whatever reason, they were the closest thing to an equal opportunity lender as could be imagined for the 1930s. On the contrary, the FHA, which was really the critical player, because they were the people who made mortgages to new home buyers. Now, the HOLC, given their mission, really had no influence over changing or moving racial settlement patterns. They were basically, their job was essentially to maintain the status quo in terms of who was a homeowner, where did homeowners live, and so forth, by keeping them in their homes. The FHA was responsible for making mortgages to new home buyers. And during their initial decades, they were racist to the core. They operated on racist principles. They had their own maps, which they used, and which certainly influenced where mortgages were made and not made. And come the late 1940s and 1950s, when suburban developers were trying to build large subdivisions following Levitt's pattern on Long Island, the FHA put pressure on those developers to maintain racial segregation. And the FHA, before they were designated unenforceable by the Supreme Court, the FHA encouraged developers to use racial covenants, and the FHA arguably behaved in an overtly discriminatory manner until President Kennedy issued an executive order in, I think, 1962, basically ordering the FHA to stop discriminating against black people. It was that bad. So this is a critical part of our history, and this had a huge effect. And that was only, if you will, the tip of the iceberg. Private lenders discriminated. And in fact, one of the things that I find mystifying as I look at all these people who talk about how the HOLC did this and that and the other thing, and that this is that they ignore the role of private lenders, or they assume somehow that a typical white male, most likely racist banker in the 1930s would need some federal map in order to discriminate against black would-be homebuyers.
Later that night, Mr. Ames has a serious talk with his son. Mr. Ames tells Gil that he sent him to public high school so that he could gain a democratic background. But now he's about to enter an environment more in keeping with his social position. At college, he will meet men of his own kind. Gil understands, because already he has developed an awareness of his class, its patterns, and its rules.
Basically, here's what we have to understand. Okay. When the maps were made back in the mid-1930s, there was a much smaller black population in American cities than there is today. And in fact, the areas that they marked as red, which were primarily the areas which had the worst housing and environmental conditions in each of the cities, were overwhelmingly occupied not by black people, which a lot of people seem to believe is the case, but by white people and primarily immigrants and the first-generation descendants of immigrants. In fact, in the 7 cities I studied, which tended to have overall larger black populations than almost any other part of the country outside the Deep South, 80% of the population of the redlined areas was white, and again, predominantly immigrants. So that's the first thing. And the other thing that's important to know is back in the 30s, in most American cities, black people lived in what were known as ghettos. Basically, these were areas where black people were allowed to live. They were not allowed to live in most other parts of the cities. And in those areas, there were poor blacks, rich blacks, working class blacks, middle class blacks, all living in the same areas in economically integrated communities. So that was the picture back in the 1930s. And by and large, also the black ghettos had the worst housing conditions physically of any neighborhoods in the city, white or black. Then what happened after World War II was there was an immense upheaval in American cities. And between the 1946, 47 and so, and the end of the 1970s, we had a phenomenon which has come to be known as white flight.
And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out.
One of the main reasons was because it was a white community.
Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely.
In what way?
I think that, well, the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
Is there to be no escape from living near Negroes? And what of the dream of middle-class respectability? If a Negro family can afford what you can afford, how do you justify your feeling of superiority? The illogic of one's own position becomes apparent, and in self-justification, the old tribal myths are invoked. What other objections, aside from the effect on property values, do you have against the Myers?
The whole thing centers around the word integration. Well, as Mr. Myers said, because his home has been anything but peaceful since he moved in. He's got 3 children, and evidently he feels that they will be accepted socially. And I don't feel that they ever will be. But the whole trouble with this integration business is that in the end, it probably will end up with mixing socially. And you will have, well, I think their aim is mixed marriages and becoming equal with the whites.
At the same time, we also had what's known as the Second Great Migration of blacks moving from the South into those cities. Now, the thing that's important to understand, and I don't think a lot of people know this, the Second Great Migration was big. It involved maybe 5 million people moving from the South to the North. But the white flight that was going on at the same time was much bigger. At the same time as 5 million black people moved into cities in the North, primarily, 15 million people, almost all white, left the cities for either suburbia or the Sun Belt. Now, what that meant, all of a sudden, there were lots of housing opportunities at all levels of quality, income, price, etc., be opening up in the cities. Whatever discrimination patterns that existed before became irrelevant because the whites were leaving. So what happened at that point, remember, is the black families both the people who already lived in the city and the people moving into the cities from the South, split economically. The poorest blacks moved into the poorest neighborhoods, which were the ones being vacated by the white immigrants or the kids of the white immigrants, and which had been redlined back in 1930s. The next sort of economic tier moved into the next higher neighborhood, and so on and so forth. So by the end of the 70s, which was when essentially white flight and the Second Great Migration had essentially come to an effective end, you had black populations that were dispersed across the entire cities, but segregated by income. So that was the process by which the areas that the HOLC had colored red back in the 30s became black neighborhoods and became the poorest black neighborhoods. And the other thing that's important to know is that the number of whites who left those neighborhoods was vastly larger than the number of blacks who moved in, because every white who could get out of those neighborhoods typically did so. But only those blacks who could not afford anything better moved in. So for example, in Detroit, if you look at the redline neighborhoods in Detroit that were overwhelmingly white back in the 30s, for every one black family that moved into those neighborhoods after World War II, 9 white families left. So at the same time as you had this racial shift going on, you also started to see the massive abandonment of housing that was so characteristic that we associate with the lowest income minority neighborhoods in our cities. So the abandonment of housing was not a function of lack of credit or mortgages or anything like that, even though there's no question there was mortgage discrimination, and that's an important point. But the principal reason for the abandonment of housing in city after city in these neighborhoods was that far more people left than moved in. Now, one thing that is true, I mean, there was huge racial discrimination in terms of the suburban developments that were being built. I mean, that's why it's called white flight, because only white people, with rare exceptions, were able to buy houses in the new suburban neighborhoods.
Yes, this is it, my hometown. The place we as members of this community call home and from time to time leave it for elsewhere. But this is home sweet home to us.
But within the cities, there was essentially full opportunity for black families to choose where they could live, and they chose based on essentially what they could afford. And what's interesting is if we look at those same redline neighborhoods today, what we typically find is they lost a lot of population during the racial shift from the 40s through the 70s. But they've also lost a lot of population since then, even though there hasn't been any racial change in those neighborhoods, because in effect, the great majority of people, and I'm talking in this case primarily black people, who lived in those neighborhoods, who managed to start earning more money, became able to move, did move. And so we see this constant process of people, whether it's through education, job promotions, whatever, people who can afford to move because they want either a better home or a better environment. Now, if they think their neighborhood is improving, they might stay and hope to benefit from the improvement. If they don't, they're likely to move. One thing we're seeing, which is very relevant to this, I think, is in all of these cities, we're seeing today what one could call black flight. Essentially, the great majority of black middle-class families are now moving to the suburbs from the cities. And in fact, and I show this in my paper, that today, if you want to see where affluent blacks live, you have to go to the suburbs. There's children, if you will, of the affluent blacks who moved into high-end urban neighborhoods back in the 60s and 70s are now moving to the suburbs. And I think it's important to understand those dynamics if you're going to plan. But the fact is, the percentage of black people in the typical metropolitan area who live today in the redlined areas is very small. The percentage of poor black people who live in the redline areas tends to be small. So, for example, one thing I show is that in most cities today, far more poor black families live in areas that were designated C or better in the cities than live in the D areas because of the way people have moved over the last decades. And so, almost by definition, if you say, as a planner in a city, we have to focus on those areas that the HOLC colored red back in the 1930s, regardless of whether the HOLC had anything to do with it, but because those are the areas of primary poverty concentration, so forth. You're likely to be wrong. I mean, that doesn't mean they're not areas of poverty concentration, but they are only a part, and usually a relatively small part, of a larger picture of poverty that has shifted dramatically since the 1970s to today. One of the most important things we have to appreciate about people, whatever their race, economic condition, they are agents. They are active agents trying to make decisions in their interest, not passive victims. I passionately believe that racism has been a central force and factor in American society and in the way that society is represented spatially. But it's never the only thing going on. That's, to me, the critical thing. Racism is almost never the only explanation, the sole explanation, or a complete explanation for almost anything. If you start positing that these maps are kind of the cause of the conditions that we see today, almost 100 years later, then you're just not recognizing the complexity of a society which is, yes, it is racist, but it is not just racist. There's lots more going on, and we have to understand how all of those things interact and relate to each other to create the reality that we live in. We've got to understand all the variables if we're going to understand what led us to where we are, and if we're going to come up with, I think, good strategies to go forward. Look, people like a clear narrative. We live in a world, we live in an era where it's all about sound bites. And I guess I'm not a good soundbiter.
Redlining.